What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this midweek episode is Julia Friedlander. Julia is the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center. And as you will soon discover, she is the perfect person to speak to about the subject we're going to discuss today, which is the sanctions that have been and continue to be levied against the Russian economy and its political class, what it is that makes those sanctions truly unprecedented, and what the intended and unintended consequences of those sanctions could be for the prosecution of the war in Ukraine, the geopolitical stability of Europe, the future of Russia, and the position of the dollar at the center of the international financial system. There is no subscriber section to today's episode, guys. The entire conversation is available on the public feed. But if you want access to the transcript and intelligence report, which includes, among other things, links to resources and materials that I used in preparation for my conversation with Julia, you can find all of that on our website at hiddenforces.io, where you can also become a premium subscriber today. Lastly, if you've derived value from this podcast, if it's helped you make sense of what can oftentimes feel like a senseless news cycle full of scary headlines, overly politicized narratives, and just outright misinformation, please take a moment to rate the podcast on Spotify and write us a review on Apple Podcasts. It makes a huge difference to our visibility, and it would mean the world for me if you would take only a second of your time right now to do it. And with that, I bring you yet another educational and timely episode with my guest, Julia Friedlander. Julia Friedlander, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks for having me.
It's great having you on, Julia. So before we get started, I want to say to everyone listening that we're recording this on Monday, March 7th. Events are moving very quickly, so some of what we say today may be out of date by the time that this episode publishes. So Julia, I think a good way to start this conversation would be for you to give my listeners and I a sense of your background and how you got involved in what I guess we would call the field of economic statecraft.
Thanks. Yeah. So I've been with the Atlantic Council for around 2 years, and the Atlantic Council is traditionally a foreign policy think tank looking at hard security. But one aspect that was missing there was the intersection between finance, economics, and national security. And so I've had the pleasure of building out a program looking at all of these issues and trying to bring together the private sector, media, external partners together with the government for decision-making purposes. I spent 10 years in the federal government. I started as an economic analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. I was the chief analyst during the Eurozone crisis. So I got to see up close and personal what the intersection between debt crises and national security could be there. I then moved over to the Treasury Department, and this was right after 2014. I had actually been an intelligence briefer to some high-ups within the agency when Russia entered Ukraine initially in 2014. And then I went over to Treasury to help design the sanctions program that was there and all the novel tools that came out of the 2014 efforts. After a couple of years there, I was at the White House for 3 years. I was the director for European Affairs in the National Security Council, where sanctions became part of everything. From Iran to Venezuela to Russia to Syria. Any policy issue that we were discussing in the national security context had to do with sanctions and economic and financial means of pursuing national security goals.
Okay, wow. So your experience is like really spot on. I can't think of anyone better to talk to right now. So I guess, where do I want to begin with these questions? So obviously everything we talk about today is contextualized by the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. And so the sanctions are a sort of reaction to that. Where are we right now with this? What has been the objective of the sanctions? Give me a kind of basic primer of like where we find ourselves today.
Sure. Well, for a second, I'll go back to what the goals were in 2014, because they stand in stark contrast to each other. In 2014, we designed sectoral sanctions, the idea that you could impose a debt and equity restriction on a foreign financial institution without fully blocking it. This was a novel idea, and it was to try to steer the Kremlin away from its course and to peel those close to the Kremlin away and say it's not in your best interest to support this policy, to disincentivize a further incursion into Ukraine. Now, fast forward 8 years later, we haven't quite determined whether that was a success. Deter Putin from going further? Was it not enough at all? Were we too weak? And the strategy now, quite frankly, is to pull the rug out from underneath the Russian economy, to actively destroy the undergirdings of its financial system. Again, in 2014, we didn't want to touch the broader Russian economy. We wanted to divide the Kremlin economy from the real economy. We even told Western businesses, please go back in, show support for those who are not part of this machine. And many did, actually. When the Russian economy stabilized in 2016, a lot of investors seeing pressure in other emerging markets around the world, Iran, Venezuela, said Russia's actually a pretty stable market to re-enter. So we played around with that dichotomy quite a bit. And now we're facing the harshest sanctions we've ever placed on a large economy such as Russia. We're essentially turning Russia into Iran over the course of weeks. The sanctions programs on Iran, right, the first time we did it from 2010 to 2012, and then the second time when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA and engaged on this quote-unquote maximum pressure campaign, each of those campaigns, as we call them, happened over the course of weeks and months and years. This is happening over the course of days. We cut Russia off from 60% of its foreign exchange reserves overnight because we were able to work together, and I say we, shorthand speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, even though I'm not part of it anymore. The G7 countries cut Russia off from 60% of its foreign exchange reserves overnight. That means that we sent the ruble soaring. It's now currently, just checked a few minutes ago, about 120 to the dollar. Yields are through the roof. The interest rates, the central bank had to raise interest rates to over 20% to try to support the currency. But of course, if you don't have a foreign market for that currency, any of these normal macroeconomic stabilizers that you might have in the case of a normal financial crisis that's not triggered by response to a war, for example, could come in. And so we've essentially sent Russia into a financial and potentially economic freefall.
Man, so many things to ask you right there, because this is so complicated. I think the struggle that I've had, and this is the first episode that I'm doing on the sanctions regime, is trying to pull out all the different pieces of this. And I think also try to understand what the strategy is, because it sounds also like they're kind of putting this together in real time. They're sort of figuring it all out. Let's take a step back. Tell me historically, how have sanctions been used in order for me to try and understand where this fits in? Because we keep hearing that these sanctions are unprecedented. So what makes them so unprecedented, and where do they fit in the sort of historical evolution of sanctions as a tool for statecraft?
Sure, thank you. And there's several ways to go about this. I would say we use the word unprecedented because of the timing and because of the scope, how fast you do this and what kind of economy you do this. As I referenced, when other major pressure campaigns amounted over years. Now, there are a couple of different ways to look at sanctions, right? The current framework that we have is born out of 9/11. The Patriot Act, for example, in counterterrorism context. So, if you read Juan Zarate's Treasury's War, what this came out of was the attempt to cut terrorists off of their assets and to keep them from essentially financing their destructive behavior. So the concept was the full power of the U.S. government, its intelligence, its financial regulation, and its judicial system to unwind these networks and put a block to them using financial means. And so it had sort of a more tactical, at the beginning, it had more of a tactical effect.
Was that because, I'm curious, I didn't know the origins of that. Is that because the terrorist networks were networks and were not countries, and so they needed to find a different way to kind of attack them? Is that where the idea came from?
Yeah, it also was that there was an actual ability to cut these terrorists off of their networks. And yes, some of it has to do with it's not a sovereign state. We have
because they don't control physical territory that they can use to fund their operations. They actually have to embed themselves into the broader financial system and economy.
Of course, there are state sponsors of terrorism, and the
Sure.
State Department does list countries like, Iran or Syria, right? That naming certain states as essentially equivalent to a terrorist organization. But of course, there were more longer term sort of campaigns throughout. For example, ironically speaking, one of the most successful sanctions campaigns is thought of to be actually what we did, the widespread embargo on South Africa to help unwind the apartheid. Yes. And there was, of course, an embargo on the Soviet Union. But the timeline that we set for success was, this was just going to be something that we did alongside consistent political pressure, particularly through the United Nations, through bilateral pressure, and all kinds of diplomatic efforts. And we sort of allowed it to play out over time. Now, fast forward, and we seem to want to achieve political means through the same financial mechanisms in a short period of time. We have electoral cycles, we have impatient leadership, and in the case of Russia, we have a hot war that we're actually trying to defund in real time, as you said. So we've gone from decades-long political pressure, what can sanctions do over the long term, to essentially trying to use financial tools as a hot actor in a war, in a physical conflict, right? So we're not going to go into Ukraine militarily. The US government, West, is not going to do that. We're not going to hot war with Russia. But what can we do, right? What are the sort of tactical things that we can add to the mix, besides, of course, arming the Ukrainians physically, to make Russia's position untenable?
I wonder to what degree Russia would agree with that assessment if they, in fact, see this kind of financial warfare as equivalent to actual war. We can talk about that as well. But I want to actually pull some things apart here, because it sounds like clearly the objectives of these sanctions, the logic behind them, is unprecedented. Is that also true for the implementation of the sanctions, the kinds of things that have been done? Because this brings us into the complexity of it. It's easier for me to understand and for my audience to understand what you just described as the objectives, right? To try to pull the bottom out of the economy, to make it so that the Russian economy cannot fund the conclusion of this war. But the thing that's complicated to understand is how that actually happens and what all the known and possibly unknown side effects of it are.
Sure. I mean, I always like to say, is that the sexy part of sanctions is putting them in place, right? Is the press release that announces the lofty goals of the policy. The unsexy part, but actually the more interesting and more important part, is putting them into place. And a lot of what we do, implicitly do, is essentially outsource the success of our foreign policy through sanctions to the private sector. Because they're the ones on the front lines who actually have to say, okay, we're a bank, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we're complying with this. Not only banks with major compliance shops, but every mom and pop shop in America, every mom and pop shop in Europe is technically obligated by law to implement these things. Now, you can imagine that for some who are used to this, many colleagues from the Treasury Department go and run major sanctions shops for large banks, and they're therefore extremely helpful. But sanctions could have a single point of failure because you're talking about all kinds of financial intermediaries that are also involved in this. And so sewing all of it up, I think we often in the public misunderstand that sanctions are leaky because they're imperfect as a tool. They're imperfect because we ask those who are obliged by law, but not by policy, to uphold them. Our private sector are not like soldiers in a war. And so that's what I think that it's often sort of a little bit misunderstood here.
Okay, so I'd love to understand that a bit more. But let's walk through the most important characteristics of these sanctions. You mentioned the central bank sanctions. While the sanctions on the SWIFT system or prohibiting certain Russian banks from accessing SWIFT has got a lot of play early on, it seems actually that the central bank sanctions are by far the most consequential ones. Walk me through what the most consequential sanctions are and how they work together in this context in order to achieve the objectives that you've laid out.
Sure, thank you. And again, because of the ability to lock up so many assets overnight by virtue of a stroke of a pen in the Federal Reserve and equivalent institutions in Europe, obviously the central bank restrictions are the most potent. The other ones are, of course, the blocking of Russia's major financial institutions. The Sberbank, for example, is not a full block, but it cannot transact in dollars and does not have access to correspondent banking. Same with VTB, the second largest bank in Russia. Russia. So again, you are essentially locking up Russia's banking system. So if you think of combined with central bank reserves, and the banks will then not have access to funds abroad as well and to their clients. And then say that these banks need assistance from the central bank and they need to be propped up. Well, the same reserves that Russia needs to use for all purposes in the economy, they might also need to use to prop up the banks. And so you're sort of leaking all of the available plumbing.
And there's no money there, right? Yeah. Especially if they're raising interest rates to prevent capital flight.
Precisely, yeah. Yeah. So, and again, just to underscore what you said about SWIFT, I think it does have in our sort of cultural memory much more of a role that it actually plays. SWIFT is equivalent of financial outlook. It's a messaging system. So just cutting Russia off from SWIFT without cutting the banks off in the first place would raise the operating costs for Russia, make it more expensive, but ultimately they'd be able to find another way to message those systems. So it's a good way to come in behind banking sanctions to close things up. But again, I think that particular aspect got blown out of proportion. And the other aspect here that's also very important is, of course, the oligarchs. These are individuals who, from our estimation, are essentially tools of the Russian state. And we used to think that we could peel them off from the Kremlin. Now it seems to be a lot harder than that. The oligarchy bases its power off of pilfering state assets from Russia. The things that should be invested in the Russian economy should go back to the Russian people. They are stored in offshore jurisdictions, or not just offshore jurisdictions, the United States, the UK, in order to, of course, enrich these individuals, but also can be used to fund the very foreign policy campaigns that we oppose in the national security context. So if you think about sanctioning oligarchs, it's not just about, these people are living above the law and serving the Russian people unjustly, but they're also instruments in the Russian state, in the campaign in Ukraine, also in Syria. So sanctioning these people has a lot to do with tightening up these restrictions on Russia's financial capabilities as well, because we estimate, and of course, these are just estimates because you can't really know, but about $1 trillion worth of assets have left Russia and are hiding out somewhere in the West.
Okay, so again, there are so many things that I want to ask you, many of which you've already talked about. I want to go back at some point to the commercial bank and central bank sanctions and what effect that they've had already on the Russian economy. I also want to discuss energy because, again, this is another point of confusion. It doesn't seem that the U.S. and its European partners have put official sanctions on Russia's energy sector yet, but many companies are self-sanctioning, so that's a complicated picture. But in terms of the oligarchs, what's the thinking behind that? Like, what's the theory at work there? Is it that somehow the oligarchs are a pressure point for Putin, and that if European and American authorities confiscate, that's the other thing, they're also confiscating their wealth. It isn't just that they are making it difficult for them to transact or do business. In some cases, they were outright reclaiming property, which itself is kind of a bit scary. So I have a question about what precedent that sets. So that's another question. But in terms of the oligarchs, what's the thinking there? Because as far as I understand, the oligarchs haven't really had power in Russia for a long time. Putin spent the first half of his tenure in office kind of making sure that he defanged them. So what's the thinking behind that?
I think you're right about that. And I think that maybe that's part of the reason why our initial strategy failed, because we thought we could pull the rug out from Putin himself if his henchmen essentially were no longer loyal. Now
because he's also been sanctioned because Putin also has a huge amount of money in this whole illicit black market tied up in all sorts of places. Even Switzerland sanctioned his money, correct?
Yeah.
Another unprecedented thing.
Yeah, and sanctioning a head of state in sanctions parlance in the U.S. at least usually signals that we're seeking regime change. So the U.S. administration would never say so. This is what we're looking to do here, is to sew up the assets. The problem is that they're very hard to find. These guys are very good at laundering their money and hiding it well beyond the reach of your everyday financial detective.
Yeah, I should mention we actually did an episode with Tom Burgess on this exact thing, on the global kleptocracy. Okay, so going back though, so I guess what you're saying is that the administration has sort of acknowledged internally that this isn't really a viable strategy, that sanctioning the oligarchs, while it might make some people feel good, it's not going to actually have much influence on Putin's actions.
Maybe, but I think maybe it goes back to also what I was saying was that this money could actively be recouped and used for malicious purposes. So this idea that it's being hidden in U.S. jurisdiction, that we actually could potentially play a role in cutting off additional Russian financial resources.
Okay, so then let's fold that into the conversation about commercial banking and commercial banks and central banks as part of this larger picture of what happens when you take parts of the system offline, you make funds unavailable that were previously available. Because that's the thing that's also interesting. A lot of times in the past, when we think of currency crises, they happen because the central bank doesn't have the foreign exchange reserves to back up the currency. In this case, the funds actually exist, but they're being sanctioned. And so I guess I'm trying to understand what the risk is to the financial system. One, how are we seeing this impacting daily life in Russia? Let's start there. What impact is this having on the Russian economy today? You mentioned the ruble has collapsed. How much has the Russian ruble collapsed? I saw days ago that 31 Russian listed stocks in the UK fell, I think, by 98%. And from what I saw, they didn't even fall that much in 1998. I think the bottom of 1998 was 94%. So it's obviously had a huge impact. Also, the stock market in Russia is shut down. So paint that picture for me to understand really what's going on the other side of the world in Russia right now.
It's almost like you've evaporated the financial system. I mean, again, they kept the stock market closed because they knew that what happened domestically is exactly what happened in London, the trading, right? I don't know if you saw, there was a famous Russian trader who went on news in Russia and toasted to the death of the stock market. It was nice to know you. I saw that, yeah. Exactly, yeah. I mean, so what you're seeing here is, and you mentioned 1998, that this is as a fabricated crisis. It's a combination of a currency crisis that is quickly bleeding over into being a sovereign crisis.
Right, and I want to make that point because exactly correct. This isn't a situation where the central bank doesn't have the foreign exchange reserves to support its currency. It had those reserves. In fact, it went to great lengths to create what people call Fortress Russia, the central bank balance sheet, for exactly this purpose. And now they've been sanctioned, and while they're there, they can't use them. And that also, I think, is unprecedented, correct?
It's unprecedented.
Except for maybe with Iran. Maybe they did something similar with Iran.
Or Venezuela.
Or Venezuela.
Again, it happened not overnight. And also, if you think about Iran and Venezuela aren't exactly global economies in the same way. They are petrostates, similarly, but we'd had sanctions, some sort of restrictions on mounting sanctions on Iran since 1979, right?
Yeah.
And Venezuela Maduro had impoverished his own economy through his own accord. And so you're not talking about their global economies that create potential huge global imbalances. You're talking about a G20 country. You're talking about the 11th largest economy in the world. So with a fabricated crisis where everything just evaporates overnight, it's like a Deus ex machina event. And so as a result of that, no one actually knows what's going to happen. And what we're seeing now is there are potential spillovers in segments of Western economies that were heavily invested in Russia. Certain industries, certain areas of the financial sector are losing out quite a bit. That's probably manageable. Some economies in Europe are going to create funds to essentially spend their companies out of this crisis. But what we're actually looking at right now is our commodity prices. Right. And then this is, of course, you want to talk about petroleum and about gas, but really one thing that these things have weird sort of knock-on domino effects. Russia and Ukraine are huge grain producers that ship globally all over the world.
Right. Russia is number one, and Ukraine is number 5. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So you're essentially raising the price on basic global commodities. It's not going to necessarily hit the United States in the same way. But if you think about bread riots and rising costs of basic foodstuffs are known to cause conflict. And so, one of the knock-on effects of isolating Russia and Ukraine ultimately is that you are pushing developing countries further into a debt hole. They were already there because of COVID, and now making the price of basic imports potentially untenable. So that's part of this as well.
Okay, so I have a question about that too. I'm trying to think about how to walk all these things through. So I do want to at least close the loop a little bit on the question about the Russian economy, because I haven't actually gotten a clear picture of what's really going on there right now. I mean, so the stock market is going to be closed indefinitely. People have been queuing outside, this was days ago, we saw images of this, people queuing outside of banks, trying to get their money out. people trying to use cryptocurrency to get their money out. All of those avenues have been increasingly closed by the government. Are businesses open? I guess there's no inflation right now because they're jacking rates, or is there inflation? Like, what is happening?
There's still inflation because jacking rates doesn't help if your economy is essentially
spiraling.
It's a spiraling effect. Yeah. So there are lines, people trying to get their money out. Many businesses are shut. I mean, if you see, especially all Western businesses, most of them are pulling out or have at least shut down their local operations. And so,
including digital businesses. I believe Google shut down their ad business. Same thing with Facebook. In fact, Russia, I think, even preemptively shut down Facebook.
Yeah, they did. But that's obviously for different
Information war
reasons, non-financial. Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think there are two reasons why that happens, that this quote unquote cooling effect happens. One is an anticipation of future sanctions, and sanctions cover not only goods, but also services. So any financial connections that a digital platform might have would also be subject to sanctions potentially. But then also the whole sort of just de-risking, this is not worth my time. I'm going to lose a lot of money, or reputational. Right. And so that's why you see major industry just overnight, major petroleum companies saying, we're going to forego major investments that we had made in the Russian oil and gas sector. I mean, maybe they'll recoup those in the magical world where Russia reopens and we have a new government there. But they're basically eating that right now.
Well, that kind of started with Nord Stream, really. I mean, that's a huge amount of investment right there that's basically going to sit idle for God knows when.
Yeah, of course, it was always a Putin-driven project that Gazprom bore the majority of the cost for in the first place.
So let's talk about the possible knock-on effects here. So you mentioned a number of things. One is obviously the oil and gas industry and self-sanctioning. That has a knock-on effect on financial markets because there are lots of intermediaries, trading companies, banks that finance the market making of the energy market. I'm curious if you have any insights there, any idea of what the speculation is about the type of leverage that's in place. I've read about the airlines industry. I mean, from what I've heard, their domestic airline industry is going to be crippled because of the reliance not just on foreign-made airplanes, but in the case of domestically manufactured airplanes, they rely on foreign-made GE and Rolls-Royce engines. Now, in terms of the commodities market and, let's say, the global food supply, this is another thing I've heard a lot about. Now, is this going to be impacted because of, one, the obvious fact there's not going to be a harvest, there's not going to be a planting season in Ukraine for the foreseeable future? Russia, I guess, won't be able to export wheat to the rest of the world, but it could export it to China. Does the war make it difficult? Do the sanctions make it difficult for them to actually, does that impact the harvest itself, the planting season? I'm not familiar with that at all. I guess walk me through the impact on the global food supply system and stuff like that. How are those things impacted by the sanctions?
Sure. I mean, whether the devastation of war affects harvesting is clear, but what I think is also important to show here is that Russia's export economy is cut off as well. Not only are there export controls, which, as you mentioned, cutting them off from refined petroleum and from high-end technology and from spare parts for their airplanes, but the fact that their insurance companies have pulled out, that shipping companies have pulled out. So Maersk, think about how you transport oil around the world. It's on tankers, right? And so if these tankers are no longer going to service Russia, the oil is going to go nowhere. The grain is going to go nowhere. And so, yes, there are opportunities to transport these things over land to the neighboring CIS states and to China, but that's not normally how these things are shipped, maybe some on rail lines. But again, it could cause a major disruption because of the supply chain and how these things are traditionally moved around the world. Maybe we would go into a little bit into China here. We think that we see them towing a very careful line, obviously remaining politically neutral. But if you're China at this point, you don't want to extend Russia a line of credit. You don't necessarily want to give them access to the 17% of reserves that they have held in yuan. It's a complicated calculation for them. The Chinese tend to actually uphold U.S. sanctions, especially their larger institutions, because they value the access to the U.S. dollar economy more than the quote-unquote adversary. And so maybe politically they'll say the quote unquote right things for the Kremlin, but we haven't seen any economic indicators yet that they're planning on stepping in. Now, are they dependent on certain areas of production from Russia? Grain? Yeah, if they need it, they'll find an alternative way to transport it over land, but these are also very large distances.
Again, speaking to the cost issue, what has Putin done so far in order to stem the crisis driven by these sanctions?
They have implemented capital controls. They have made sure that any export profits have to be denominated domestically in ruble. So any aspects where the Russian economy could still be profitable, you could still actually sell something to recoup the costs, are now being held locally. And that you've seen some of the capital controls help boost a little bit. When they implemented them, you saw the ruble stop tanking that day. But of course, when markets opened the next day, it went straight back. So again, maybe they've bought themselves a little bit of time through this, but it is a short trick.
So this is actually a good question for me to ask you. So as I understand, Russia now demands that all oil and gas sold is paid for in rubles, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously they don't want it to be paid in dollars because then they can't access it. So they're demanding rubles. That helps give temporary support to the ruble. In addition, because of the self-sanctioning that's going on by a lot of companies, the price of oil and gas is going up, which means that the Russians currently are able to actually extract more money from the global economy than they would otherwise. Does it even make sense at this point for the Biden administration not to slap total sanctions on the oil and gas sector, considering the fact that they're losing out on the one hand and not gaining benefits on the other as a result of the way that the sanctions are being implemented?
I think, yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it's a very active debate right now. I believe the administration is talking about this right now. The Europeans are thinking about it. Of course, energy is the third rail here because that's the one area where Russia does have leverage and where we are depending upon Russia. I mean, after the Venezuela crisis, the United States itself started importing a certain grade of Russian crude. So again, even if you have an OPEC plus meeting and you release strategic reserves, the sort of potential impact of a Russian cutoff from oil is going to, because of its traded commodity, is going to drive the price up. In reality, though, Russia can't actually export its oil, though the oil traders who are in the Russian market are seeing rock bottom prices for actual Russian crude in the country because the practicality of actually selling it on the market isn't there. So it's sort of this weird dual reality of high prices and low prices.
Because, for example, they can't get the tankers to transport it because a lot of these companies that would normally transport the fuel aren't willing to do it. And a lot of the banks that would normally finance it are also cutting off their financing.
Precisely. So should we impose an embargo on Russian oil? I think it's an open question. Of course, it's politically very palatable. But the realities of this sort of self-sanctioned economy that we've put ourselves into means that whether it's the service providers coming from the West or the inability for Russia to finance it or to extract it or whatever, there is a de facto embargo coming into place already. So one of the concerns that, I might have is that by implementing an embargo, you are driving the price up further because of the symbolism of it while not actually changing all that much on the ground. And so I think that's the discussion right now. With gas, it's a different story for Europe. You saw messages coming from Germany, for example, that we're not going to touch this. This is an area where the real key vulnerability for Europe built over decades and actually aggressively cutting off the Russian gas supply could have direct deleterious implications for the economy.
Well, this is the thing that's wild because I saw some figures recently, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe I saw that the effective price of natural gas in Europe right now, because obviously the natural gas market is a more dislocated market than the oil market because of the difficulty of transporting natural gas. You have to liquefy it and you need special ships to transport it. The effective price was something along the lines of $600 per barrel oil in terms of BTU. Do I have that correct? And what's going on in the natural gas market right now for Europe? And what does that mean for people heating their homes? And thank God, I guess we're coming into the spring now, but what are we looking at here?
I mean, the effective price is different than what these countries are actually paying right now because they do have long-term contracts with Gazprom. So essentially the going market rate is maybe this equivalent of $600 a barrel. But in fact, as you say, it's sort of a dislocated market. There are different ways of buying and selling gas, either
spot price. We're talking about the spot price is 600.
Exactly. That's very different BTU than equivalent. Your pipeline. Yeah.
Yeah. So the concern is more going forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here's my last question, Julia, and it's a kind of an open-ended question that could lead to a series of questions. What we've described right now is unprecedented use, again, that word, of sanctions that rely heavily on the U.S. financial system, the strength and the primacy of the U.S. dollar. How does the implementation of such sanctions impact the future viability of the dollar system and people's willingness to actually use it when they see that not only, I mean, again, to the point about the oligarchs, assets are being seized, accounts are being frozen, central bank reserves are being frozen, hundreds of billions of dollars of central bank reserves. So, what does this mean for the dollar and the primacy of the dollar and the dollar system coming out of the back end of this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and no one can really quite answer it. I think it would start by saying there's sort of a short to medium term consideration and there's a longer term consideration. Of course, the Russians did make great efforts to de-dollarize. They are, held again, the United States only holds about 8.5% of those reserves. The other ones are is elsewhere in Europe. So we couldn't have done this without our allies, right? This is a question also about, the
Asian allies as well.
Asian allies as well. But in terms of where the assets are, it shows that you can't. The United States has blown up the possibility of doing any of this unilaterally, right? We saw when we tried to do Iran again and Venezuela to a large degree in a unilateral fashion, something like an oil embargo didn't work. It fell apart. They found great ways to access of practicality of shipping to each other, and so. Again, like the power of these sanctions is the fact that we did them together with other like-minded partners abroad. But then it shows that despite de-dollarization, if you invade another country, others are going to take, others are going to take notice as well. So I think this is also a question about the future role of the euro, which has come to replace the dollar in some of these markets that the U.S. has been so aggressive towards. Looking forward, you would say, all right, maybe we can really only use such strong central bank reserve sanctions on a major global economy once. After that, others are going to take notice and say, we're going to do all we can to put them somewhere else. And so I think looking at one of my concerns is that, if we fail, quote unquote, fail at what we're trying to do right now, this big gamble to try to end a war through financial means, will have undermined the viability of these measures about saying this is a reasonable policy choice to make in a situation like this. The other aspect is that it would incentivize countries that have the financial flexibility to put their assets in other sort of safe havens. If you think, Western jurisdictions have always seen like the safest place to move your money because we can shield you from financial crisis and meltdown, but maybe we're actually the riskiest jurisdictions of all if you don't stay in our favor. And so I think that there is a long-term trajectory away from a fully dollarized economy. I don't think it only has to do with financial pressure. I think it has to do with overall global macroeconomic rebalancing. But we do put a little bit of pressure on the accelerator by doing this. But that shouldn't scare people because everything remains overwhelmingly dollarized. If you want to move a large amount of money around the world, you still have to do it in dollars. You still have to transact through New York. And so, I think that the idea that by doing this are going to be undermined the dollar domination is probably is overblown for now.
So let's actually pick that apart a bit. What would seem to me to make sense is that the countries that are on board with the sanctions are not going to be disincentivized from using the dollar as a result of what has happened here. The entities that are going to be disincentivized are obviously entities like the Russian government, but also perhaps sources of funds from the illicit sort of global kleptocratic ring and dark money ring that circulates. Has been a huge source of funding for the dollar system as well. How impactful will that be, do you think? I mean, what will the impact be on the dollar over some period of time? What do you think is going to happen?
I think actually some of this stuff has an adverse effect of sending a lot of people back to the dollar. So a lot of the, even in the height of the COVID crisis, for example, when we thought the US economy was doing quite poorly, we were still a huge safe haven. And so I think when you see what's happening in Russia right now, the foreign exchange markets are buzzing back and forth, dollar to euro, dollar to euro, dollar to euro. And so in some ways, it is sort of a move to strengthen.
In the short term.
Yeah, in the short term. Yeah, exactly.
And what does the long term look like for you? And what is the long term? Is it 5 years? Is it more than 5 years?
And I think it's more than 5 years. I think you'll see a slow erosion of the use of dollar in international transactions and currency markets. I mean, you see that, Russia has, Rosneft, for example, decided to denominate all of its trade between China and Russia in euro. So since 2014, right? Because they thought that would shield them from what we had done. And so you could see, against trade settlement is different than bank settlement, but I think that it is a symptom of what is to come. Yeah, and I think that there's also, the question of central bank digital currencies as well. And that is again, my team at the Atlantic Council does a lot of work on this, where we say that it is an incentive for countries to design CBDCs, and just shows why the US has to play a bigger role in this sphere to sort of set the terms for central bank digital currencies. So they're not designed by global challengers in ways that don't comply with our financial system.
So when you say there's an incentive for CBDCs, are you saying there's an incentive on the part of a country like China to implement a CBDC as a result of this? Or are you saying, generally speaking, people are incentivized to do it?
I think that there are multiple reasons to want a CBDC. I think the Chinese principally want it as a mode of surveillance. But
no, I mean in the context of sanctions. That's what I'm
I think that they are looking to potentially use them for sanctions evasion, but I also emphasize that any version of a digital currency is much more traceable than thousands of shell companies linked around multiple jurisdictions around the world. And so, in some degrees, the Bitcoin has been able to shut down a lot of illicit, quote unquote, illicit Bitcoin accounts coming out of Russia over the past couple of days. And so it is an indication that, any version of a digital currency has much more traceability than some of the traditional money laundering aspects of the commercial economy.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I'm trying to understand still I don't understand why, let's say, the U.S. Federal Reserve would be incentivized, or the Treasury, or whoever would be sort of leading this effort would be incentivized to launch a CBDC as a result of this.
No, I think that it's about setting the stage over the longer term, not particularly as a result of this, but for financial interoperability. Other countries might be incentivized to seek out alternative means of payment as a result of this. The U.S. incentive is to sort of slow that trajectory so that when we look at CBDCs in the larger macro and microeconomic context, that we have designed the rule book for them.
Right, that we haven't missed the boat. Sure.
Exactly, yeah.
Let me ask you this. One of the hard lessons that the Russian central bank I'm sure has learned from this experience is that there's a distinction between money that is a financial liability of someone else and money that is hard money, something like gold. And they did go to great lengths to increase their exposure to gold in their portfolio. I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe you do. I think it was like 20% of the portfolio was gold, something like that.
Something around there, yeah.
Yeah. So do you expect, given the fact that there is no good alternative to the dollar, this is sort of the problem. What are the reasons why, if not the primary reason, that the dollar has managed to be supreme for so many years is because there hasn't been a good alternative to it. That remains true. So does that mean that countries that want to diversify their exposure are going to rely more on hard money, sort of non-liability alternatives like gold? What does that mean for gold, for example?
It could drive. Yes, I think that, gold could see a resurgence, and the Russians did use. There are obviously difficulties offloading gold as well, but I think that is one part of the Russian choice there. I think that maybe what it boils down to is you're not going to have these big sovereign wealth fund accounts that you stick in one big pot in the Federal Reserve or at the Bundesbank of Germany, right, where you have a single point of failure. So for me, I do agree with you, and I think everybody agrees that there's really no alternative to the dollar at this point, but there is a way to diversify where and how you store this money.
Julia, you've given me a really great introduction in what feels like a chaotic soup of information that's flying at all of us in real time the last few weeks. I really appreciate it. For people that want to follow you, how do they do that? Where are they able to, where are you on Twitter? And do you have a website that people can read your stuff?
Sure. Well, I'm at the Atlantic Council, which is a major think tank in Washington, D.C., and my Twitter handle is @JFriedlanderDC. Very creative.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. It was great having you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.